So good day everyone, welcome to our Gender and Society class. So for today's topics, we'll be discussing the gender and sexuality. So this will be our learning outcomes. So at the end of this chapter, the student should be able to, number one, to differentiate gender from sexuality, explain gender socialization. We're going to identify gender stereotypes and the problem stereotyping brings, and also to discuss the sexual orientation and gender identity expression, or what we call the SOGI. Sex and gender are two very essential yet underrated parts of human life. So they affect all aspects of our lives, from how we look at and act in the jobs we take to how we regard the laws and values of our society. So this chapter will establish the difference between the sex and the gender, define gender roles and relationships according to the United Nations and other relevant national bodies, and also to determine how generated interactions affects one's everyday lives. So it will examine gendered interactions at various levels within the family, the workplace, the community, and larger society. So let's talk about sex. So the good, the bad, and the complicated. So while sex is often referred to the act of reproduction, or scientifically copulation, it is nonetheless an important notion of how pop culture sees sex. According to popular culture, sex is something done for pleasure and perhaps in a more Freudian sense, it is what drives people to do certain things. So the association of sex with pleasure and versa may make people dismiss it as a serious topic for study. So meanwhile, because sex is so often equated with and related to gender, gender as a topic of discussion is likewise disregarded. Yet, so by showing the difference between the sex and also the gender and laying the groundwork for this difference, perhaps you as a student, may start questioning discriminatory practices in society that relate to sex and gender. So this discussion defines sex through its biological, again, biological and not cultural definition. So sex in the biological sense is a category for living beings, specifically related to their reproductive function. So for most living creatures, there are two sexes. No? So we have the male and the female. So the female sex is determined by the following characteristics. So the first, it produces egg cells which are fertilized by another sex and bears the offspring. So the female sex, on the other hand, produces sperm cells to fertilize the egg cells. Now, what is chromosomes? Okay, chromosomes determine one's sex. Okay, so the chromosome XX equates to female and XY equates to male. So these pairs of chromosomes are distinct because the differences in their characteristics are necessary for reproduction. So the copulation or the union of the sexes of XS and XY, or male and female, produces what we call the offspring. So genitalia, or the organs used for reproduction, and secondary sex characteristics are largely influenced by one's X and Y chromosomes. So these chromosomes determine whether someone's body will express itself as a female or a male. Let's discuss hormones. Hormones also play a large part in the definition of one's sex. So the exposure to hormones in the womb affects how the organisms develop as a male or a female. So physical features related to the secondary sex characteristics are also influenced by hormones. So both the males and the females have estrogen, testosterone, and also progesterone, but in varying amounts. So usually the males have more amounts of testosterone and the females have more amounts of estrogen. So hormonal imbalances, the both natural and induced, can also result in someone born as a female to have more testosterone than her male counterpart. Biology is learned in school, but the enactment of one sex is experienced differently in one's culture. So when one sees a person, he or she does not see an XX or an XY, but a male or a female. Perhaps in a more accepting societies, one sees a male, a female, or an LGBT. So because of one's perception of maleness and femaleness, his or her view of another is prone to what we call change. So take, for example, the case of the commercial models displayed in advertisements along EDSA, for example. So these models are actually perceived to conform to society's definition of what is conventionally attractive, enough that they become the face of the certain products or brands. So because a model on a billboard is a two-dimensional, so his or her looks allow people to assume anything about him or her. So if that person is a male striking, what seems to be powerful pose, it could be assumed that the man is a powerful person. If all the males presented in advertisement are in powerful and dominant poses, one can presume that the power and dominance are associated with maleness or masculinity. So similarly, in advertisements are seen to take care of people, no? Their spouses, children, or parents. So one associates females with caring roles. Thus, to be female is to care. So these roles, which do not necessarily have anything to do with reproduction, become tied to one sex. So this where gender comes in. So what is gender? So gender is a socially learned behavior usually associated with one's sex. So it is short for gender relations between the sexes or how the male and the female relate to one another. So gender is also based on how people see themselves and their tendency to act along either the masculine or the feminine line. Gender is also a social construct that determines one's roles, expected values, behavior, and interaction in relationships involving the men and the women. So it affects what access is available to men and women to decision making, knowledge, and resources. So the sex and the gender are two different things, but one's gender is usually associated with one's sex. So note the difference between the sex and gender in the following table. No? So for the sex, so it's physiological, it's related to production, congenital, and unchanging. But due to the advances in science and other societal trends, one can now legally and physically change his or her gender. Well, under the gender, it is social, cultural, it is learned behavior, it changes over time and varies within the culture or among culture. The question now is, does sex correspond does sex correspond to gender? So Many scientists, psychologists, and sociologists believe that sex does not determine one's gender. So the femininity or the behavior that once associated with females may not actually be tied to a woman's sex. So similarly, a masculinity is not tied to one's gonads. So the whole idea of being a woman, therefore, is based on gender and society's belief in how a woman should act instead of biological functions that are inescapable. So the notion that one's biology predetermines the roles one must have in life should not be the case at all. So doing household chores is said to be a woman's job, yet there are some men who do not who do or there are some men who do the cooking and cleaning at home. Aggressive sports are said to be of more for men, but for every men's sports team, there is a counterpart for women. So in this type of scenario, or in this types of scenario, gender role socialization comes in. When we talk about gender role socialization, it is defined as a process of learning and internalizing culturally approved ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. So it starts as soon as one is born and manifests from the color associated with one's gender to the roles one sees his or her gender performs the most. Socializations affects all the parts of one's identity by dictating what is acceptable to do because of one's educational background, class, religion, and also gender. So thus, the female and male gender roles develop. So one socializations um, regulates his or her perceptions of genders in two ways. So we have the uh, the external regulations and internalized self-control. So each society has social norms that have been developed over time due to the values and beliefs that it holds. So when we talk about external regulation, it involves various institutions dictating what is proper and normal based on one's identity. So it affects how one sees his or her gender and that gender in relation to others. So external regulation can happen through censorship of some forms of sexuality. For example, that homosexuality is bad, or subtle forms of control such as microaggression, subtle messages with sexist assumptions behind them, like only girly boys do housework. So because of these external regulations enforced by the society, notions on the gender are absorbed and internalized social control is formed. Internalized social control causes a person to police himself or herself according to society's standards and norms. A consistent practice will eventually affect all aspects of his or her personality in turn, resulting in the policing of others, expanding and perpetuating this regulation. Similarly, if someone finds himself or herself deviating from what society finds normal, he or she may become deviant and excluded from society. Let's discuss the gender stereotypes. So gender stereotypes develop when different institutions reinforce a biased perception of a certain gender's role. So these institutions include the family, the church, the school, and the state, and also the media. So these beliefs can be limiting if seen as prescriptive of a gender's role rather than descriptive of the many possible roles one can have. So gender stereotypes are of four types. So we have the sex stereotypes, the sexual stereotypes, the sexual stereotypes, and the compounded stereotypes. So when we talk about sex stereotypes, this sex stereotypes are generalized view of traits that should be possessed by men and women, specifically physical and emotional roles. So these stereotypes are unrelated to the roles women and men actually perform. Second, the sexual stereotypes. It involves assumptions regarding a person's sexuality that reinforce dominant views. For example, a prevalent view is that all men are sexually dominant. Another notion is heteronormativity, or the assumption that all persons are only attracted to the sex opposite theirs. Next, the sex role stereotypes. When we talk about sex role stereotypes, encompass the roles that men and women are assigned to based on their sex and what behaviors they must possess to fulfill these roles. The last one is the compounded stereotypes. When we talk about compounded stereotypes, these are assumptions about a specific group belonging to a gender. So examples of group subject to compounded stereotypes are young women, old men, single men or women, women factory workers, and the like. Let's now discuss the SOGI. So the abbreviation SOGI stands for sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. So sexuality is different from sex, as the former is the expression of a person's thoughts, feelings, sexual orientation, and relationships, as well as the biology of the sexual response system of that person. The different terms standing for SOGI are further defined below. So the first, the sexual orientation. Sexual orientation covers the three dimensions of sexuality. So namely, the first one, sexual attraction, sexual behavior, and so also sexual fantasies. Number two, emotional preference, your social preference, and self-identification. And number three, heterosexual or homosexual lifestyle. The sexual orientation involves the person to whom one is attracted and how one identifies himself or herself in relation to this attraction, which includes both romantic and sexual feelings. Gender identity. Gender identity refers to one's personal experience of gender or social relations. So it determines how one sees himself or herself in relation to gender and sexuality. A person could identify himself or herself as masculine or feminine. While gender expression, it determines how one expresses his or her sexuality through the actions or manner of presenting oneself. What is LGBTQIA? So the abbreviation LGBTQIA is short for lesbian, gay, transgender, queer, or questioning, intersex, and asexual. So this category describes the distinct groups outside of heteronormativity who are usually defined by their SOGI. When we talk about heteronormativity, so it is defined as the notion that being heterosexual or the attraction to the opposite sex is the standard for correctness. Heterosexual, or is what we call the straight, refers to people who have sexual and romantic feelings mostly for the opposite gender, men who are attracted to women and women who are attracted to men. While homosexual, it who describes people who have sexual and romantic feelings for the same gender. So men who are attracted to men and women who are attracted to women. There's what we call cisgender. Cisgender is someone whose gender identify or gender identity corresponds with his or her biological sex. So a person can be a homosexual at the same time a cisgender. No? In addition, lesbian pertains to women who are attracted to other women. The gay refers to men who are attracted to the other men. It can also be used as an umbrella term for homosexuality. Bisexual or bi denotes the people who are attracted to both genders. Finally, the transgender is an umbrella term that refers to someone whose assigned sex at birth does not represent his or her gender identity. So the labels were created to recognize the identity of those who are considered outside the norm of society. So these words and terms were popularized to show those who fell outside the norm that they are not alone and that there are others facing the same struggles. While these are the usual words used when discussing LGBT issues, they are no way stable, fixed, or exclusive. So they are temporary as the terminologies for sex and sexuality can change depending on the direction of the LGBT movement. So these scenarios are brought to light because of how trans issues are slowly coming to public awareness, but the same issues have been faced by women throughout the history. That ends my presentation.